Y'all are watching Fight Feed. In this video, I am going to be going through an S tier list of Jon Jones. This S tier list is going to be going through all of Mr. Johnny Meat / Johnny Bones Jones wins in the UFC, ranking them from the highest to the, ranking them from the lowest in the E range to the highest in the S range. Sorry, I didn't mean to sound like the pacer test there, guys. But before I dive into the tier rankings for each fight, I'm going to read off to you or share with you my creation in terms of how I'm ranking these different fights. The E tier in this case is going to be taking a look at any of the fights that I feel are either one, controversial wins on the side of Jon Jones, two, didn't necessarily add anything to his legacy, even if it was sold that way. So that's kind of what I'm looking at for E tier. Any of these controversial wins he's had and non-legacy defining moments, if you will, within his career. And then when we take a look at the D tier, these are fights that either were competitive when they shouldn't have been, or it's really just against not the highest ranked of contenders, if you will. So that's what our D tier is going to be. The C tier is going to be more respectable in terms of the opponents that Jon was facing, but not necessarily super impressive. So these might be aging vets, maybe might just be lower level fights within his career. When we get to the B tier, this will probably include some more of the title defenses, but specifically looking at B tier, we're talking solid wins over ranked opponents, those who are somewhat stylistically dangerous for Jon, or those who are competitive because they're durable, things of that nature. And then the A tier, obviously being the second best in this case, is really just looking at any of those solid ranked wins over competitive matchups. These are top contenders or former champions, obviously, assuming that these fights don't fall within one of those earlier categories. And then finally, the S tier, the upper echelon of Jon's wins, which is going to showcase those legacy-defining moments and historically significant opponents. Now you're going to see that there's my opinion on the historically significance. The historic significance is going to be a bit different than I think what has been sold to us by the media. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the E tier. So my first fight for Jon Jones in the E tier is going to be Matt Hamill. This fight for Jon was actually a very solid performance. He beat the dog shit out of Matt Hamill. Some actually say that he regained his hearing after this fight. Just kidding. Sorry, guys. Anyways, this fight was a very good fight for Jon. He demolished Matt Hamill and ultimately ends up getting a loss on his record, the only loss that's still on his record, obviously, because it was an illegal 12-6 elbow, which we know is now legal in the UFC. The reason I put this at E is because although this happened and he has a loss, I would say 95 to 98% of people, probably 99% of people, feel this loss doesn't count. And I don't think anybody even equates this as a loss. We all talk about Jon Jones as being an undefeated fighter. So I don't think that this really did anything. It's just really a road bump on his pretty historic career. Nothing really to write home about here, and it's definitely not a performance. I think from a performance standpoint, Jon Jones did very well, but because he got the loss here, it's almost like one of those things where you want to forget that this even happened, right? So that is my take on the Matt Hamill fight. The next fight that I have in the E tier is, and this is going to probably shock some people, but I don't give a shit, Jon Jones versus Stipe. Guys, I understand the whole point that Jon Jones made about I want to beat the best heavyweight of all time, and I know that he was selling the tickets for this fight basically in 2023 after he beat Ciryl Gane. This fight for me, guys, does not although Jon and some people like to sell it as he beat the heavyweight GOAT, he's now the GOAT of all. Guys, how many people went into this fight thinking Stipe stood a chance? I mean, like, I had that glimmer of hope that, like, could Stipe catch him? Maybe, I don't know. And I didn't have a dog in the fight. I really loved Jon Jones previously, and so, like, I didn't want him to necessarily lose, but I just think that this fight, guys, it does nothing for Jon Jones, in my opinion. The only thing it did was further cement the fact that someone else should have been in that spot fighting Tom Aspinall. Anyways, this fight went exactly as I think most expected it to. It was pretty much a hand me to Jon in terms of getting a title defense at heavyweight. Yeah, just not a very good performance. Not that it was not a good performance from Jon, but it's just not a fight where I would rate it at all what it's been rated as by, you know, the media and other fans. Like, this win does nothing for me, and when I'm looking at Jon Jones' record, because I can't get over the fact that Stipe was 42 years old, was coming off of a 3-year hiatus from the sport after being brutally KO'd in 2021. I don't know how we can look at that fight and think that this is like some legacy defining moment for Jon Jones. And then finally, guys, to finish off our E tier, we have the Jon Jones versus Dominic Reyes fight. The reason this is in the E tier, guys, is because it is the most controversial win on Jon Jones' record. I would argue there's a larger percentage of the MMA fan base who believes Jon Jones lost this fight than Jon Jones won this fight. So right there, I have to put that in E tier. When I've rewatched the fight myself, I've already said this in other videos, Jon Jones, I feel, ends up getting the nod from the judges solely based off of optics. I think that Dominic Reyes probably clinched the first 3 rounds. But that's where it's like round 3 is a bit questionable, just because that's when I think Dominic Reyes was starting to weather a little bit. Whereas Jon Jones kind of, 4 and 5, he picks it up and ends up winning both those rounds. And I think optically speaking, if you're looking at rounds 3, 4, and 5, you could argue that judges probably give Jon round 3 just based off the end of round 3 kind of going in Jon's direction. And then round 4 and 5 go to Jon, like very, very handedly, similar to how rounds 1 and 2 went to Dominic Reyes. And so based off that, Jon gets the win. But like I've said, if you go back and rewatch a lot of this, most people feel Dominic Reyes won this fight. And that is why this one falls into E tier. It ends up being a great win for Jon because Dominic Reyes was an undefeated prospect who was really just steamrolling most of the light heavyweight talent he was put up against. And he had such a fantastic showing against Jon Jones. But I just think that Jon, on the other hand, did not have a good performance in this fight. And it was very questionable whether or not he should have got the nod for the win. Okay, guys, that executes and completes the E tier. Let's move on to the D tier now. So to start us off on the D tier, then guys, for those of you who are not well versed on Jon Jones fights, you can actually go watch my other video I've already posted where I break down each of these fights. But we're going to start off with, in the D tier, JJ and the locked Mortal Kombat character. This locked character is Jake O'Brien. He's pretty much a no-name in MMA, to be honest, unfortunately for him. And although I share his same first name, I feel this fight is a D tier because it wasn't controversial by any means. Jon handedly won this fight, but Jake O'Brien was simply just, he was a heavyweight who dropped down to light heavyweight, didn't have much of a name to him, didn't have much of a career. Like, he was not a guy that, like, Jon beating this guy was not a telltale sign that he's going to be the GOAT because of this win, is where I'm headed. And so I think when you look at the legacy, Jake O'Brien, it's not something that is anything to write home about. And that leads perfectly into the next locked Mortal Kombat character, which is Gusmão. And sorry, guys, Gusmão, I guess it doesn't really matter because they're both locked characters. Gusmão was also another guy that I have in the D tier. And the reason why is because Gusmão, he debuted with Jon Jones. So they both had their debut fights. Both had very, little records at the time. I think one of them was 5-0, one of them was 6-0. And Gusmão actually never got a win in the UFC. So I think this really just goes to show you, like, and if you were to ask any Jon Jones fan, I don't think anyone's even going to remember this fight or the Jake O'Brien fight. But Jon Jones did knock out Parker Porter in the regional scene. Just keep that in mind. Next fight, Stephan Bonnar. Okay, so this is a D tier. Now, this is only a D tier, I would say, because there's Stephan Bonnar at the time was a very good win for Jon, but I think when you look at his career collectively and kind of where Stephan Bonnar went after that fight, it's not necessarily I just can't rate it that high in terms of it being a legacy performance, if you will. Jon was dominant in it, but I just don't think that this fight was like anything to write home about, really. It's a great win for Jon, though, especially at the time. If you were to rate it at the time, this would be much higher, right? But now, after Jon's kind of gone through the who's who of light heavyweight from a Legends perspective and just, you know, his current roster, this one just doesn't live up to some of those other wins. And then finally, guys, we've got the last one of the D tier, and it's going to be Mr. Saint Vince Ovens. I don't know how the fuck to say his last name. DePru Ovens. I don't know. Why am I forgetting like how to say his full fucking name now? Ovens St. Preux. I'm retarded. Sorry, guys. Anyways, taking a look at this fight, the reason this is a D tier is because although Jon won, it was a short notice fight, and he looked very rusty in this performance. It was not a. I would expect Jon Jones, and the caliber of fighter he is, to go out there and just mollywop a guy like Ovens St. Preux. He didn't do that, though. He looked very rusty in this fight, and so I don't rate it very high performance-based for Jon in his career. That ends our D tier, guys. Let's jump in now to the C tier. And in the C tier, we're going to start it off with a matchup between Jon Jones and Matushenko. I can't even really say this guy's last name. Vladimir Matushenko, this is a guy who actually had a decent record at the time when he fought Jon. He was 24-4. Now, the one thing I would call out, though, is that Matushenko had a 17-year age differential between him and Jon. So he was 30, I think he was 37 or 38 when he fought Jon in this fight. Jon was like 24 years old. That math doesn't really math, but I can't remember the exact age difference, but basically this guy was at the very tail end. And I want to keep in mind, guys, during this era, there were not many 38 to 40-year-olds that were fighting in light heavyweight. It was still it's always been a young man's sport, but when we look at these larger divisions, it's more common to see guys fighting longer. But in this fight, I think that was a bit of a peculiar thing, right? Jon fighting a guy who's, in his late 30s at the tail end. And it just really wasn't it was just a quick finish from Jon. And Matushenko was really just a gatekeeper of light heavyweight, like the top 15, maybe like the top 11 to 15 guys. Now, at the time, there were no rankings, but, not much to write home about, but it's definitely rated higher because if you look at his record, I think it is a great win for Jon as he continued to move up the rankings in UFC. The next fight that I have here is Jon Jones versus Brandon Vera. Brandon Vera was actually one of the more highly touted names in the light heavyweight division, but I think what happened here and why I put this as a C tier performance is really just because although Vera had a recognizable name and had some good performances previous to this, he was on a decline, had a couple losses, and was on the back end of his career. So not necessarily something where you're going to see Jon Jones beat him and be like, this guy's a world beater. He's going to go on to do so many great things. Like, this just wasn't one of those fights. The next fight that I'm going to put here is the Jon Jones Gustafsson 2. Okay, I have to say, so for this, the reason I have Gustafsson 2 here in the C tier is that Jon Jones looked fantastic when he fought Gustafsson the second time, okay? And although he got back that, the back and forth fight they had in the first one was controversial, Jon comes back in the second time, fighting the guy that is the same age as him, which it took several years of Jon's career before he fought Gustafsson the first time. And Gustafsson's actually the first guy that ever had the same age as Jon, was a bit taller than Jon. So Jon goes out there and beats the shit out of him in the second fight. The reason it's a C tier for me is because Gustafsson, similar to the other guys here, was on a decline. I think he'd actually had a couple, maybe one or two losses right before going into this title fight with Jon. And so I think that knowing that in the first fight, Jon was not focused, barely trained, and then we knew he had a fire lit under him when he went into the second fight, I feel like it was pretty pretty obvious that Jon was going to get the W here when he fought Gustafsson the second time. So no surprises, honestly. The next fight here, and this might be controversial, but I've got Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane. The reason I have this here, I will say when Jon beat Ciryl back in 2023, I thought it was an amazing win. But the reason now, like with hindsight, I can put this at C tier is that we know Ciryl has zero ground game. Like the guy's ground game is absolute dog shit. So there's no, I can't rate this as a very high win because it's like Jon Jones could have fought Francis. I know that Francis didn't work out because of the negotiations, but what we wanted to see is Jon go against someone who he couldn't overpower in every category, right? I think that although Bon Gamin had really good striking, I would never rate his striking higher than Jon's, and the grappling advantage for Jon was just so heavy here that there's no way I could put this higher than C tier. Like it was pretty obvious Jon would get the win. Now, maybe not as obvious as him getting a round one, guillotine finish, but he literally acted like a big brother, set him against the fucking cage, which if you're a younger brother, you'd be put against the wall and your brother just chokes the shit out of you until you scream uncle. That's basically what happened. So that is what I have in terms of my C tier. So that's going to complete our C tier. We're going to move on now to the B tier. We're getting up here in these fights. The first fight I have in the B tier is Jon Jones versus Thiago Santos. If you've watched my other videos, this is the first pay-per-view card I've ever purchased, and is when I went from casual fan to diehard UFC fan, watching every weekend. This fight, guys, is a B tier because I think Thiago Santos was a higher level opponent, had solid wins in the UFC, had knocked out Jan Blachowicz, definitely someone like a force to be reckoned with within the UFC's light heavyweight division. The problem I have with this one, though, is it's a split decision win for Jon. It was a very close fight, actually. And it's one of those fights similar to the Reyes fight where Jon won this fight, and I think Jon ends up winning this fight by using his dominant kicks, but it kind of happens in the later half of the fight. So it's like he was really competitive in the first, round or two, and then I think as round 3, 4, and 5 pick up, Jon just, found his mark and was just landing those kicks. I think Thiago Santos had 2 torn ACLs. Like his knees were fucking destroyed after this fight. But I think it's a B tier because it's still a solid win. I just think that because there was some controversy with it being a split decision, being a lot closer than I think people anticipated in that of a Jon Jones fight. The next fight, we got Jon Jones versus Anthony Smith. This fight was a good win for Jon, but like I said, these guys are good fighters, and these are great defenses for Jon, but Anthony Smith was not, I don't think he ever had the skills to go out there and beat Jon Jones. Now, we have to give Lionheart some credit, and I think this is where the Lionheart nickname comes from. He could have taken Jon Jones' belt if he just said he couldn't continue after the illegal knee. But this fight really just, I think everyone kind of expected this of Jon, to go out there and get a win over Anthony Smith. But it's still a good win nonetheless. It's just that Anthony Smith didn't have the biggest name at the time. And it wasn't like, I don't think people really thought Anthony Smith would win that fight, guys. The next fight on this list, we got Jon Jones versus Chael P. Sonnen. And the reason I have this in the B tier is mainly because it was a short notice, kind of scrapped together fight. Maybe not a short notice, but I'm trying to remember. Was this short notice? So I know there was the original short notice fight that Jon had with him that got canceled because Jon didn't want to fight him. I don't know if the second one was short notice, but I do know that Chael Sonnen was coming off of a loss at middleweight, and he went up a whole weight division to fight Jon at light heavyweight. And for that reason alone, I got to say it's a B tier because Jon goes out there and beats his ass and was not even a close fight whatsoever. And Jon just outsized and outmatched Chael in all aspects of the game. So this is a dominant performance from Jon, but I think there's just a few asterisks there with Chael coming up from a shorter weight class, smaller weight class, and just not having the tools to beat a guy like Jon Jones. Also having a significant age disadvantage in this fight as well. The next fight I have at B tier, this is actually a really good win for Jon as he's rising up the ranks. He beats an undefeated Ryan Darth Bader. And this win is great for Jon because he goes out there, and Ryan Bader, I mean, if you look at his record at the time, I think he was 12-0. He had kind of beat the who's who of like the prospects that were rising up in light heavyweight. So I think coming into this was a real test for Jon. And Jon goes out there and just beats the shit out of Mr. Beta. He also takes him down, gets him in I think it was a rear naked choke, and chokes his ass out. So very, very good win for Jon. And this is going to start to pick up as we go through these fights, obviously, being at the top of B tier with Jon Jones and his win over Vitor Belfort. This is a great win. Now, the thing that is an issue here is that Vitor also, this is where it was a short notice, I believe. It wasn't the Chael fight, it was this fight. Vitor came in on short notice from middleweight, and he gives Jon a very hard test because he gets Jon locked up in two very, very solid arm bars that Jon gets out of somehow. Like, the guy's arm had to have, like, fucking snapped a little bit. Like, torqued it very, very hard, and it was a very solid arm bar that Jon was able to get out of. So I put that at the top of B tier because I think it's the first time Jon was truly tested in his title reign, where he got into some deep waters and was able to navigate, but then also ends up submitting Vitor himself. So this ends up being a great win for Jon. And that is the final note on the B tier. We're going to now move into the A tier. In the A tier, gentlemen, and maybe one or two women, we've got Jon Jones versus DC number 2. This was a dominant performance from Jon, guys. If you remember or saw this fight, Jon just beat the brakes off old DC. But I think the issue that I have here, and this is why it's not higher ranked, is just that DC was 38, so he was, aging out of his career here. And then also, this is just the asterisk of Jon end up getting a no contest for this fight due to steroids. That is just, it's a great win for him, and it really put the nail in the coffin over that whole DC rivalry. But there's that no contest that lingers here that is, definitely not good. I rate it much higher than the other wins, though, because this was a very handed performance from Jon Jones. And although there's that asterisk, he went out there and beat DC, which DC could not lose to anybody else at this time. So it's a great win for Jon. The next fight I have is Jon Jones versus Rampage Jackson. Now, although Rampage Jackson had significant experience going into his fight with Jon Jones, I think that Jon obviously was always going to have the edge from a grappling perspective, although Rampage throughout his career seemed to be like the immovable force for those who would try and take him down. Jon was able to just handedly do that and ultimately get that win over Rampage. Rampage is a former legend of the sport, or I guess current legend of the sport, but former champion himself. First unified champ from Strikeforce. So I rate this a very good win for Jon, especially from a title defense perspective. When you're tallying up all of these markers for Jon, this is definitely one of those, because this is a title performance that I don't think anybody could argue with. No asterisk. Jon just goes out there and he deploys his game plan and is able to dispatch of a legend of the MMA and UFC realm. The next fight we got, though, is Jon Jones versus Rashad Evans. Pretty similar to Rampage, but this fight was a bit more competitive, obviously. Jon and Rashad Evans had both trained at Jackson Wink, so there's some drama there with all of that. But Jon, really does get a pretty solid performance and win over Rashad Evans, who himself was a pretty streaking contender, former champ at the time. So I think this is a great win for Jon as well when we look at his overall legacy. The next fight is Jon Jones versus Glover Teixeira. This is a great win for Jon, guys, because at the time, when Jon fought Teixeira was a streaking contender and ends up being a future champ, obviously, as we know, when he beat Jan Blachowicz. But Glover at the time was undefeated in the UFC and had really taken things by storm. And so I think this was a first time where people also felt, Jon going in there is going to have a striking advantage. But when it comes to a ground game, there's no way Jon is going to be able to, hang with Glover on the ground. But Jon goes out there and just does what Jon does, right? Finds a way to win and deploy his game plan that worked better in his favor. Great win in terms of, adding a feather in the cap for his legacy. And then to end our A tier, we've got Jon Jones versus Lyoto Machida. Similar to some of the others on this A tier list, like Rampage and Rashad, Lyoto Machida is a former champ at the time when he goes to fight Jon Jones. Very, very solid competitor in the light heavyweight division. The reason I have Lyoto at the top here is because this is one of the legacy-defining moments for Jon. One of his highlights of his career when he dropped his lifeless body to the canvas and just slumped into his face slumped with the arm. He had the Family Guy fall. This is a solid win for Jon Jones. He went out there and really just demolished Lyoto Machida. So this ends up being one of the best wins of his career, which is a perfect segue into our final tier, the S tier. In the S tier, we've got the first. Oh shit, we're gonna have to do this. Okay, yep, just making sure. You guys got a preview of the next one. That's all right. It's all right, man. So S tier, we've got Jon Jones versus Gustafsson, number 1. This fight was not only an amazing fight, it won Fight of the Year that year by the UFC. It's already been inducted in the Hall of Fame. And it's like a cornerstone legacy proving moment for Jon Jones. It's the first fight where he really had a tough test, and Gustafsson, just a back and forth fight. Gustafsson really put it on Jones. Jon gets the decision win. A lot of people felt it was controversial, but I do think Jon deserved the win, from the judges. But I think when we look at this fight, this really just showed Jon's tenacity, his heart, his ability to be down and out but come back. And then also what I would say it shows is that Jon had this very close fight, but he literally is quoted, and also his coaches have quoted this as well, of not training for this fight. Like, he barely trained. He kind of went out there and just did his thing. When you consider that he was able to go out there and have that competitive of a performance with a guy in Alexander Gustafsson at the time was undefeated, or maybe had one loss, very, very crazy that Jon was able to go out there with no training and actually put on that performance. And it's just like I said, it just defines those moments of his legacy where he was down and out, but found a way to scratch and claw his way to a win. Maybe eye poke his way to a win. Sorry. Anyways, next fight, DC versus Jon Jones, numero uno. This is a very, a lot more of a competitive fight than obviously the second fight, but this fight had so much heat behind it, guys. There was so much drama. And then also you got DC, who is an undefeated prospect at this time, going into a fight, former Olympian, and then also being undefeated. I think that a lot of people felt Jon Jones was going to be out-grappled and outmanned by DC, but it actually went the other way. Jon Jones is getting takedowns on a former Olympian, and DC can do nothing to Jon on the ground. So this fight ends up being like one of the staples for Jon's career from a title defense standpoint. DC had really mauled everyone in light heavyweight that he could, and even after Jon has some drama here when the belt gets taken from him, DC ends up becoming champ and, defending several times. So I think Jon getting this first win over DC was just such a monumental moment for his career. And I think the only other fight, guys, that I would rate higher and is the final of the S tier is Jon Jones' win over Shogun Rua. This fight, guys, Jon went into this short notice at 23 years old. Shogun Rua is 29, so not so old where you're like, oh yeah, Jon's got the advantage. If anything, you would argue Shogun had the advantage from an age perspective, being that he's like grown man strength, but like not that old yet. Jon literally put a clinic performance on at 23 years old. Like, opened the fight with a fucking flying knee. Like, dude, this guy went out there like that belt was money or a lunchbox that Shogun stole from him, and he was going to get that motherfucker back. So the way that he won this fight, and to not only win this fight in the way he did, but also secure to be the youngest fighter in UFC history to become champion and still hold that record to this day, I feel that this fight has to be at the very top of Jon Jones' legacy-defining moments, especially when you're looking at everything as a whole. Like, to be the youngest champion and win it in the way he did, and also look at the historical aspect of Shogun Rua having a pretty lengthy defense, of the belt himself, and just some of the performances he put on before fighting Jon Jones. This fight ends up being the most crucial in the history of Jon Jones' career, in my opinion. So there you guys have it. That is my S tier list for Jon Jones UFC wins. Comment below what you guys think about this S tier list. Tell me where you disagree or agree with my picks. Make sure you give this video a like if you enjoy any MMA content. And then also, make sure you subscribe if you aren't already, because I'm going to be posting a ton more content. The next video that I plan to put out is just a comparison between Jon Jones and Tom Aspinall in their road to the title. Thanks again, guys, and I will see you in the next one.